I mean, I suppose we're all aware of what happened in Inch last week and the week beforehand. I suppose it's it's one of a number of issues that we've seen in terms
Now, you
of.
made a deal, you know, that there would only be a fixed number at the moment staying there, and then when all the fire certs and everything come through, that perhaps more. But did you know what you were going to see, or were you ambushed by what you found?
No, I wasn't ambushed. Look, I went down, I suppose, in some respects, to make up for the lack of an engagement process that we would have liked to have done. The difficulty that we have at the moment is that when we get new international protection accommodation agreed and contracts signed, we have to move it as fast as we can because we have still a number of people unaccommodated, still some people on the streets. That means that we don't have the running time that we would previously have had in terms of being able to engage with the community.
But
And
did
that to
you
some
always, even when the pressure wasn't on from,
Yeah.
particularly those seeking international protection?
Previously, we would have had a number of weeks at least on running. The problem with Inch was it was a matter of days. And I think in that period of time, it's very difficult to get the message conveyed that we want to, in a coherent way, in a way that can involve dialogue.
Okay,
as
so
well.
it didn't happen, but you went down and you had dialogue.
Yeah.
What did you make of their concerns, though? Because, you know, it's the kind of hotel, when it was open as a hotel, with some holiday accommodation exterior to the hotel, that you drive to. I mean, it's out of the way, to put it mildly. So you'd expect tourists, families with cars, to fetch up there and spend their holiday there for a few days and tour maybe the county. If you were living there permanently, there wouldn't be a lot to do.
To be fair, and I met 5 people, the 5 people I met, all their concerns were quite reasonable, and a lot of them had to do with actually the welfare of the men staying there, and as you mentioned, the transport connection options for the men staying there as well. Now, it is part of the contract that there is transport on site and that the men can go in and out to Ennis on a regular basis during the day as well. And a lot of what they were asking about was in terms of supports for the men as well. And I suppose I've committed to, and we've started the process of developing a support and educational program for the men, and that has already started. It started earlier this week as well, because they wanted to see that the men were in a good position to actually move on and get involved, work eventually as well. We do hope they'll be able to work within a period of time as well. That should kick in a month or two as well. So a lot of the concerns were reasonable, and I think in all of the new places that we've opened, a lot of the concerns have been similar. And it's that first week is always the most difficult because it's a new location, it's a new set of people in there. Often it's new management as well, and the community is new to the idea as well. So it's often the hardest point in the journey of a new accommodation centre.
Now, people are making reference to the fact that you have, a large enough cohort of men, young men, in their maybe late teens, early 20s, 30s, whatever, all together. And that's not a normal social milieu. Perhaps in a boarding school it is, but it's not a normal social milieu. And that kind of compression can lead to problems. People from varying different backgrounds, varying different experiences. Many of them claim to be, the victims of war. God knows what they've seen. How do you justify that kind of milieu? Because it wouldn't seem to me to be the ideal social mix.
Well, it has to do with the configuration of the buildings and how we can accommodate people as quickly as possible. I would say there are many locations around the country where it's working well, and while there might have been concerns with some of these at the start, it does work well. I mean,
where they're all male cohorts.
Yes, Borrisacane is a good example. Rosscray. There's been other places around the country as well, and we actually spoke to the people in Inch last week, and I mentioned this to them, and we're going to see if we can try and connect them up with situations where it did work out in the end as well. Look, it's all about pressure and space and how quickly we can give people shelter and safety and the kind of buildings that we can do that as quickly as possible.
The numbers have multiplied this year of those seeking international protection. We know all about the Ukrainians who have a special set of privileges under EU law, but the numbers seeking international protection have multiplied.
They've actually gone down a little bit on last year, in terms of the trends, in terms of January and February,
gone down, but they're still
very significant, and they're still much higher.
If you go back to 2019, for example.
Yeah, we're still dealing with large numbers as well. And
now, why do you think that is? Because the war, the world is a war-torn place.
Yeah.
There have been famines, crises, disasters ongoing in various parts of the world. Add into that the war in Ukraine. As I say, they're a special case. But why do you think that we're getting such an influx of people from disparate parts of the world to Ireland?
It's not just Ireland, I suppose, as well. It is a European phenomenon. All European countries are experiencing this at the moment. I think there's multiple reasons for it. I think COVID and the ending of COVID, obviously, people's ability to exit a country and get out of a country during COVID was very, very limited. I think that's definitely a very real factor. But as you said, there are conflicts all around the country of different kinds as well. And we are seeing quite a large movement of people across the world at the moment. And Ireland, as one of the better off countries in the world, is going to be one of the destinations. And I think there's an acceptance at government level and indeed at European level, or reception and accommodation systems for people coming in here seeking protection need to be bulked up significantly.
Now, what do you mean in terms of quantity?
In terms of our scope of being a scale and scope of proper reception centres to be able to take people in and assess their applications quickly, it needs to be of a larger scale. Like the white paper model, I think, is still the template in terms of how we do this, where we have large reception centres, purpose built. Probably
that's going to take forever.
State land. We're looking at a site already to get the first one going in terms of.
But it's going to have to be built from scratch.
Most likely, it's possible that we will be able to acquire other ones as well, suitable buildings as well. And then the phase 2 of the white paper would involve community-based accommodation as well, which we have started on that as well. That said, we're not as advanced in it as we possibly are. But ultimately, I think we're potentially looking at an accommodation system for people here seeking protection that could be 3 times what we had last year as well. And that's what we probably need going into the future based on current patterns.
Now, we know the stories about people arriving here with no papers, and they arrive on airlines, and we had a report from Barry White about that. That seems like a ridiculous situation, that they've got on a plane with papers, they fetch up at immigration with no papers. Now, I understand there may be people who are, people smuggling effectively, and that they're being paid by the people, they're given a passport, it's taken from them by this people smuggler before he or she gets off the plane. They collect all the passports and so leave these people still on board the aircraft, ready to deplane with no papers. Is that what's happening, or are people deliberately trying to mislead?
I think it's very important to try to put your step in someone else's shoes here when they're in a country that's got an oppressive regime, that's very often a failed state, where there's very questionable human rights standards in many cases. In those countries and in those situations, it is very often not possible for someone to get a regular travel document to exit the country.
How do you know when they arrive?
Almost by definition. This is really important because it's
I understand.
I've heard
all
it
this.
discussed.
We've parsed this many times. That some people cannot have papers.
Yes.
Cannot exit. They have to exit in an illicit way.
Yes.
They have to sneak out basically and make their way across Europe sometimes and other parts of the world to get to what they regard as a safe haven. I understand that.
Yeah. They have to do what they can to stay alive. They have to do what they can to save their family. That has been the case for a long time as well, and sometimes that will mean using documents that are not standard documents. And there are many people who have done that legitimately. They have a legitimate claim, and they've been granted status because of their legitimate claim as well.
And how do you know?
will do anything to get out of the country?
How do you know
if your
when
life
you
or your
don't
family
have
is in danger?
the identity of the person because they've no legitimate papers? How do you know who you are letting in? There's no way to check up. There's no kind of DNA check or fingerprint check or any biological check that assures you that people are who they say they are.
There's a whole very detailed process the International Protection Office undergoes. They have detailed country of origin information. They have lots of procedures and checks and balances in terms of delving into someone's case as well. And there's a whole interview process and repeat interview process and verification of documents and efforts to get other documents and verify stories and so on.
I mean, do they
forth.
take pictures, for example, of someone who claims to be from a particular country and try to get in touch with the authorities of that country to make sure that, for example, they're not a criminal, not a wanted person?
I don't know the detail of it, but what you described there could actually be extremely risky for someone whose life is in danger and they fled a particular country and regime and are trying to hide from that regime
but
and get
how
safety.
do you assure yourselves that the person who says they're fleeing from this, that or the other is in fact fleeing from this, that or the other? How do you know?
As I said, the whole set of processes in terms of interviewing, checking, looking for other documents, verifying, looking at country of origin sources of information as well, and liaising with other authorities in other countries as well. Country of origin, though, would be difficult if there is a dangerous regime there as well, and the person has fled from their life. But there are extensive checks and balances, and not everyone gets refugee status in the end of the day either as well. That's important
yesterday
to
on
say.
the programme, Barry White had featured two people who were living in tents, only arrived here in recent days. One came from Tunisia, had lived in France for quite a while, and then eventually got into a container at the payment of €1,000 to some people trafficker, and fetched up in Belfast and took the bus or the train down from Belfast. Now, someone who's lived happily in France and whose second language would certainly be French rather than English, you're wondering how come they end up in Ireland?
I actually listened to that interview, and there was no indication that the man lived happily in France. In fact, if I recall...
Oh, he said he was being pursued. But France is a huge country.
Yeah.
From the tip of it to the top of it, it's infinitely larger than many, many times larger than Ireland. So, I mean, is it credible that someone is coming to Ireland simply because Ireland is a safer place than the UK, for instance, because he came from Belfast? He had therefore already entered the UK.
Look, I mean, we're kind of getting into the weeds. I mean, Tunisia and France have very strong connections. You got to ask yourself what the man is running from if he goes into a container and he expressed his awareness of the danger of going into a container, and he paid €1,000 to do it as well. You got to have to think, what is that guy fleeing? So I mean, it's dangerous. It's very dangerous to second guess people.
What is he looking for? I mean, the word is out that our social welfare system, our benefit system, is actually quite generous. And maybe, I mean, does the government never ask itself, is this a possibility that people are, looking around, seeing where's the best deal for me, where can I get the most, and pick Ireland because we are, as you say, wealthy and generous?
Look, I've worked in the area of migration for over 20 years. I've never met a migrant who's come here based on checking what the welfare rates are. People come here because the country is stable. People come here because we have a functioning democracy. And ultimately, people come here and leave their own country of origin as well, I think, because for similar reasons that our own people did in previous
What
decades.
about the other
Because
guy?
there's opportunity.
The guy from the Caribbean that you also heard
family.
yesterday. We don't know which country he came from. He came from the Caribbean and he ends up in Ireland on the streets living in a tent. Now, that's not an ideal destination. But why would someone from a Caribbean country want to come to little old Ireland? I mean, do you ask yourselves that question?
Well, absolutely. His application will be assessed and the country of origin information will be assessed. I just think it's a little bit dangerous to second guess everyone who comes here looking for protection. I think our first reaction has to be that we take them at face value and look at their personal situation.
And then take 5 years to process them.
Oh, well, I would agree with that. That's way too long. And it's not 5 years at the moment. It's down to 10 months, and that's increased dramatically in the last 2 years.
I mean, as long as I can remember, since direct provision was set up, we've been calling on this programme and other programmes for the whole process to be speeded up. In all justice, like children who are perhaps babies when they come here, they're of school-going age when the decision is finally reached, and that's not fair on them, that suddenly they may find themselves exiting from the country into no man's land.
Absolutely, that's not fair on them, and it's one of the reasons I signed up to the programme for government as well, that we would dramatically change that situation as well. Processing times have been dramatically changed even in the last year. You were looking at 17 to 24 months last year. We're down to 10 months now. And I heard Minister Harris speak earlier this week as well about his commitment to getting more staff into the IPO office this year, which has essentially doubled in the last couple of years as well, to push those processing times further down as well, because that will help everyone, I think.
I think it's important to say that most people coming here are probably genuine, that they are fleeing some sort of unacceptable situation in the country from which they've come. There used to be the whole Dublin Convention thing whereby people had to stay in the EU country in which they first landed. Whatever happened to that convention?
Dublin Convention is still valid. I mean, I would say...
But why does it not hold? Because people cannot actually fly from many places directly to Ireland. They have to come through a third country.
You will see in a lot of those cases their case being transferred to the country where they landed as well. I would say a lot of people come here and genuinely make an application under protection. They may not get it. That doesn't mean that they weren't trying to scam the system in any way. They just possibly didn't understand that their specific circumstances wouldn't fit. And if you have an opportunity to make your life safer, to protect your family, and if you think an application for protection will do that, I can understand why people...
No, I can understand that totally. But also, we've been pushing again and again for a proper visa situation. There are economic migrants who are looking to have a better life for themselves and for their families. Absolutely nothing wrong with that. Generations and generations of Irish people did precisely that. Why not just have a proper visa? You're like an economic migrant. We need workers. If you're qualified, you're willing to work, in you come, but we'll give you a visa. What's wrong with that?
Yeah, we do have that. It's the work permit system. Minister Coveney is over that. We've seen
tying people to particular employers, which has given rise to scandals in the past.
It's opened up quite a bit because of the labour situation at the moment as well. In terms of the occupations where you can get a work permit, it's broadening almost every month, I think, in terms of what is an eligible occupation to apply for a work permit for. And you've seen the numbers have gone up recently as well in terms of successful work permit applications.
Now, how many centres do we have right around the country for immigrants who are maybe in the process of being processed?
Gosh, you on the spot there now. I don't have the full figures.
No, but I mean, we're talking about more than dozens. We're talking about...
Well, since January last year, I know we've opened 150 new settings for international protection applicants. They will be of very varying size, from down to 10 to a couple of hundred people as well. I would say in the majority of those as well, they've opened well, and the community has accepted them as well. And I think that's the bigger story. That's probably not as interesting, and I understand why that's the case. But by and large, the response of the Irish people to people who have come here, especially in the last 18 months looking for protection, has been extraordinarily welcome, and it's remaining that by and large as well on the ground and in communities across the country.
Now, the reason perhaps I was pursuing you so much about those who should not be here and who are not processed properly, not turned back. They'll quote the Australians. They have done on this program. You arrive in Australia, you don't have the papers, you're turned back. You arrive in the United States, you don't have the papers, you're turned back. We don't necessarily want to be as draconian as that. But, when people hear or suspect that there's scamming going on, it creates a political climate which is not nice.
Yeah, I mean, the evidence of what you call scamming, I'm not sure what it is exactly. To be honest with you, people are making claims for protection. They're assessed. They either get granted or they don't. If they don't get it granted, they're asked to leave the country. And by and large, people actually leave the country. And when you're in that place where you've been refused, you're not entitled to anything here in terms of state services.
Are you concerned about the border? We heard from one person at least, and he knew of more, and Barry White in his investigations knew of more, who just simply get to Belfast, and it's an internal flight, and the DUP would not have it any other way from any airport or ferry in the UK. Can't be asking for papers to move from Coventry to Leeds. Therefore, you can't be asking for papers to sail the Irish Sea. Is that a concern?
Look, I think ultimately we have to look at where the person came from originally. Their path here, as I said, is going to be defined by the urgency of the situation that they had to leave as well. Are there people crossing the border? Yes, I think that's clear. But you got to look at their point of origin and why they left there and what they had to do to get to Ireland as well, and see it in the round, I suppose, as well.
Now, you're in the process of converting some office blocks to migrant accommodation, and there will always be people complaining, saying, well, that's in the middle of an industrial estate, you can't do it there. But, there are creches in the middle of industrial estates. There are nursing homes in the middle of industrial estates. Your reply, I presume, would be needs must. Absolutely.
Look, we have people on the streets, Minister O'Gorman is answerable as well in terms of a court case that's pending at the moment. We haven't been able to meet our international obligations of being able to give people basic shelter, and that's a really grave situation. So we have to look at options we would never have looked at before.
And this of the idea of flotels, which if you'll pardon the pun, was floated a number of years ago and rejected at that time, when maybe ferries were available on the second-hand market quite cheap. It might be rather more expensive to do it now.
Yeah, my understanding is the department is looking seriously into that, and that is because of the situation I've described in terms of people on the streets. We are looking at every possible option to give people shelter in a safe situation.
Do you have any rules of thumb about the proportionality of the numbers of migrants from wherever they come that go into any particular town or city or county? I mean, a big city like Dublin can absorb, obviously, quite a few people without anyone actually hardly noticing. But we heard from Mayo where they claim that, too much of the population of the county is now represented by migrants. Do you have rules of thumb about that you may change the culture of a place, the nature of a place, if you get the numbers wrong?
Certainly when locations are being looked at, the level of services in that location or near it are absolutely...
But pure numbers, I mean, in addition to the medical services and all those other services, purely in terms of numbers, if you get any large cohort of people arriving in a small place, they're going to have perhaps a disproportionate impact. Do you have any rules of thumb about that?
I suppose the quick answer is no, because numbers is a fairly basic metric. You have to see the fuller picture of a town as well, in terms of, as you said, services, access to transport as well. But going back to your own phrase, it needs must at the moment, and we have to weigh that up with the situation of people on the streets.